I am Claire, 32 years old, and I just destroyed my entire family on Thanksgiving Day. I stood on the porch of a $2 million Seattle mansion, holding a truffle stuffed turkey. My father blocked the door, looked me in the eye, and told me I was not invited. Over his shoulder, I saw my sister, my brother-in-law, and my so-called best friend laughing at my expense. I did not yell, I did not cry. I just walked back to my car and made one phone call that wiped out everything they claimed to own. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The crisp autumn air of Seattle bit at my cheeks as I balanced the heavy roasting pan in my arms. I had spent 6 hours preparing this truffle stuffed turkey following a recipe my grandmother used to make. I was standing in front of a sprawling modern mansion in an exclusive gated community. This was supposed to be the grand housewarming and Thanksgiving celebration for my younger sister Audrey and her husband Jamal. I walked up the wide stone steps, mentally preparing myself for the usual barrage of backhanded compliments and passive-aggressive remarks that accompanied any gathering with my parents. I expected tension. I expected to be the target of their jokes. What I did not expect was the heavy oak door swinging open to reveal my father Richard, standing squarely in the doorframe with his arms crossed and a scowl on his face. I smiled and lifted the roasting pan slightly, offering a cheerful greeting. He did not step aside. He did not return the smile. Instead, his eyes scanned my simple wool coat and practical boots with absolute disgust. He planted his feet firmly and looked me dead in the eye. "You are not invited, Claire. Go home." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there frozen on the welcome mat, my mind struggling to process what he had just said. I asked him what he meant, thinking this had to be some sort of cruel, misguided joke. But Richard's expression remained entirely stone cold. He leaned forward, lowering his voice so the neighbors would not hear, but ensuring every word dripped with venom. He told me that I did not fit in here anymore. He said this was a high society gathering, a celebration of real success, and my presence would only bring down the mood. The sheer cruelty of his delivery, the absolute lack of hesitation in his voice, paralyzed me. I had endured years of being treated as the family scapegoat, the quiet middle child who never lived up to their impossible standards of flashy wealth and social climbing. But being physically barred from a holiday dinner, left standing in the freezing cold, holding a meal I cooked for them, was a new low. My hands began to ache from the weight of the pan, matching the sudden hollow ache in my chest. Unable to comprehend this level of rejection, my gaze drifted past my father's broad shoulders and into the grand, brightly lit foyer. The scene unfolding inside the house burned itself into my memory forever. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over a lavishly catered spread. In the center of the room stood Audrey, my 28-year-old sister, draped in a designer silk dress. She was the undisputed golden child, the one who could do no wrong. She was clinging to the arm of her husband, Jamal. Jamal was a 30-year-old African-American tech entrepreneur who never missed an opportunity to boast about his latest startup venture and his supposed millions. They were looking toward the front door, pointing in my direction and laughing. But the image that truly shattered my heart was standing just a few feet away from them. Rachel, my best friend of 10 years. The woman who knew all my secrets, who had cried on my shoulder through breakups and hardships. She was holding a crystal flute of champagne, dressed in an outfit I knew she could not afford, looking right at me. She did not look sympathetic. She was smirking. The realization washed over me like ice water. Rachel had betrayed me. She had traded a decade of genuine friendship to social climb with my toxic family, securing her invitation to the elite circle by stepping directly over me. Before I could even speak, my mother Patricia emerged from the crowd and stepped up beside my father. She was dripping in pearls, her face arranged in that terrifyingly sweet smile she always used before delivering a fatal insult. She looked down at my roasting pan and sighed heavily. "Claire, darling, you really must understand. Jamal is about to sign a $5 million funding round with a major venture capital firm tonight. We are hosting his most important investors. We simply cannot have you here. Your shabby appearance and your constant negative energy will completely ruin the family image. We need to project wealth and success, and frankly, your struggling lifestyle is an embarrassment to everything Jamal and Audrey have built. The audacity of her words hung in the freezing air. My mother was standing in a house she did not own, bragging about money she did not have to impress people who did not care about her, all while treating her own daughter like a stray dog on the porch. She told me to take my little turkey back to my small apartment and have a quiet night alone. She actually patted my shoulder, a condescending gesture of fake pity, before turning her back on me to rejoin the party. In that precise fraction of a second, something inside me completely snapped. The lifetime of yearning for their approval, the desperate need for their love, the endless cycle of trying to prove my worth, it all evaporated. It was not replaced by tears. It was not replaced by screaming or begging. It was replaced by a brilliant, blinding clarity. I looked at Richard, who was reaching out to pull the heavy oak door shut in my face. I did not drop the pan. I did not cause a scene for the investors they were so desperate to impress. I just nodded slowly, letting a soft, genuinely calm smile touch my lips. I understand perfectly, I told them. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. I turned around and walked down the driveway. I could hear the heavy door click shut behind me, sealing them inside their illusion of grandeur. I walked down the street, my footsteps echoing in the quiet suburban night, until I reached my car, parked discreetly around the corner. It was not the beat-up sedan they thought I drove. It was a custom-armored luxury SUV, completely blacked out. I set the turkey on the passenger seat, slid behind the leather steering wheel, and took a deep breath. For years I had allowed them to believe I was a failing ordinary worker. I kept my life private because I knew how they destroyed anything good. They had no idea that I was a senior venture capitalist. They had no idea that the shell corporation owning the very mansion they were partying in belonged to me. And they certainly had no idea that the investment fund Jamal had been begging for, that $5 million lifeline, was my company. I pulled out my phone and dialed the private number of my chief financial officer. He answered on the first ring. I kept my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of emotion. Activate all the clauses I instructed him. Pull the $5 million funding term sheet for Jamal's startup immediately. Contact the property management division and execute the emergency eviction clause for non-payment of rent on the Seattle estate. Call in every debt. Do not wait until Monday. I want it all revoked right now. I hung up the phone, leaned back against the headrest, and watched the distant lights of the mansion. The countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. Inside the mansion, the heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing out the winter chill and leaving the family to their grand delusions. Richard turned away from the foyer, dusting off his hands with a sharp, dismissive motion, as if he had just disposed of a bag of rotting garbage. He strode right into the grand dining room, where a massive crystal chandelier illuminated a table overflowing with caviar, roasted duck, and vintage champagne. The air was thick with the smell of expensive perfume and roasted meats. "Well, that handles our little pest problem for the evening," Richard announced, his booming voice cutting effortlessly through the soft jazz playing from the hidden surround sound speakers. He grabbed a fresh crystal glass of bourbon from a passing waiter, taking a large, satisfied gulp. She actually thought she could just waltz in here with some pathetic homemade turkey and ruin Jamal's big night. The absolute nerve of that girl. Uncle David, already 3 glasses deep into the top shelf, liquor let out a loud, grating bark of laughter. His face was flushed red, his tie loosened around his thick neck. He leaned back in his velvet chair, adjusting his tight collar with a clumsy hand. "I always said that girl was a lost cause, Richard. Remember when she refused to co-sign that loan for Jamal last year? Her own brother-in-law asks for a tiny, insignificant favor to get his company off the ground, and she acts like we are asking her to donate a kidney. Completely selfish. She has no concept of family loyalty." Richard slammed his hand on the long mahogany table in fierce agreement, making the silverware rattle. "Exactly. We asked her to take out a simple personal loan. $50,000. It is pennies." Jamal needed the seed money for his initial software prototype, but no, Claire starts lecturing us about financial risk and credit scores. She works some dead-end corporate desk job and suddenly thinks she is an investment banker. I told her right then and there you do not turn your back on family when they are building an empire. But she has always been a bitter, jealous girl. She wants everyone else to fail just because she cannot succeed. Patricia sighed deeply, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. She played the tragic, long-suffering mother to absolute perfection. I have tried, David. Heaven knows I have tried to fix her. But she just lacks the ambition our Audrey has. Look at our beautiful Audrey marrying a true visionary hosting the social event of the season in this magnificent estate. Claire simply cannot handle seeing her younger sister succeed. She came here tonight just to cast a dark cloud over Jamal's triumph. It is pure envy. Jamal, wearing a custom-tailored velvet blazer that he had undoubtedly bought on credit, wrapped his arm tightly around Audrey's waist. He flashed a brilliant, overconfident smile, projecting the exact image of a Silicon Valley prodigy on the brink of making millions. He swirled his champagne, looking around the room as if he owned every soul in it. Let it go, folks. We do not need her small-minded energy in this house. By midnight tonight, Apex Holdings is going to wire $5 million directly into my corporate account. I am revolutionizing the entire tech space. I gave Claire the chance to get in on the ground floor. I told her support the family, support Black excellence, be a part of the next big tech unicorn. But she has a poverty mindset. You cannot teach a loser how to win. Audrey giggled, reaching up to kiss Jamal's cheek. She smoothed down her designer silk dress, soaking up the validation and attention from the room like a sponge. She is just obsessed with playing the victim. She has zero drive. I mean, look at her friends. Well, her former friends. Audrey gestured across the table to Rachel. Rachel leaned forward immediately, eager to perform for her new elite audience. She desperately needed to prove she belonged at this high society table, even if it meant violently tearing apart the woman who had trusted and loved her for a decade. She wanted their approval more than she valued her own integrity. "Oh, you guys have no idea," Rachel sneered, a wicked gleam dancing in her eyes. Claire is completely delusional about her own abilities. Last year, she spent 3 grueling months drafting this massive obsessive marketing strategy. She actually thought it was going to get her a promotion at whatever boring mid-level company she works for. She cried on my shoulder about how hard she worked on it, pulling all-nighters, stressing over every detail. So you know what I did? The entire table leaned in, captivated by the malicious gossip. Rachel paused for dramatic effect, ensuring all eyes were glued to her. I told her the plan was absolute garbage. I told her she lacked industry vision and should just scrap the whole project before she embarrassed herself. She actually believed me. She cried and threw the entire portfolio in the trash. Then the minute she left, I took her exact presentation, changed the font, slapped my name on the cover page, and pitched it directly to my CEO at the media agency. It got me my promotion to regional director. She practically handed me a 6-figure salary because she is too weak and insecure to trust her own instincts. The grand dining room erupted in roaring, echoing laughter. Uncle David slapped the mahogany table, spilling expensive red wine onto the imported Persian rug. Patricia smiled proudly at Rachel, raising her glass in a triumphant toast. That is what we call sharp business acumen, Rachel. You are a survivor. You know how to play the game. Claire is just collateral damage in the real world. They basked in their shared cruelty, feeding off each other's toxic energy. In their twisted minds, they were the ultimate winners. They convinced themselves that Claire was nothing more than a pathetic, jealous failure who deserved every ounce of misery she received. They ate the expensive food bought with stolen credit limits, drank the vintage wine paid for by elaborate lies, and celebrated a $5 million victory that was currently vaporizing into thin air. They were completely blind to the reality that the mansion they stood in, the funding they relied on, and the very ground beneath their feet belonged to the exact woman they had just locked out in the cold. 200 yards away from that spectacular display of blind arrogance, the freezing Seattle wind howled against the reinforced steel of my vehicle. Inside the cabin of my custom armored SUV, It was dead silent. I did not need the loud, desperate validation of a crowded dining room. I preferred the absolute terrifying quiet of real power. I reached over to the passenger seat, gently pushing the roasting pan, holding the rejected turkey out of the way, and pulled a matte black military-grade laptop from my leather briefcase. The biometric scanner glowed a faint blue as it read my fingerprint, unlocking a system protected by layers of enterprise encryption. The high-definition screen illuminated the dark interior of the car, casting a sharp reflection against my eyes. A massive, complex financial dashboard appeared displaying global market fluctuations, real-time property acquisitions, and venture capital funding pipelines. In the top left corner of the screen, a sleek minimalist logo rotated slowly. Apex Holdings. For the past 10 years, while my parents paraded Audrey around country clubs and bankrolled her lavish, superficial lifestyle, I had been building a financial fortress in the shadows. When Richard kicked me out of the house at 18 because I refused to follow his outdated, narrow-minded career advice, he told me I would end up working a minimum wage job for the rest of my life. He swore I would come crawling back begging for a handout. I never asked him for a single penny. Instead, I took a job scrubbing floors at a private equity firm. I spent my nights quietly listening to every recorded boardroom meeting, absorbing every aggressive market strategy, and teaching myself the ruthless mechanics of venture capitalism. By 25, I had executed my first major corporate buyout, using leverage and brilliant market timing. By 30, I was a ghost in the financial world, operating a multi-billion-dollar empire entirely through proxy boards and anonymous corporate trusts. No one knew my face. No one knew my name. Wall Street simply referred to the head of Apex Holdings as the architect. It was a hilarious, poetic irony. Inside that dining room, my family was drinking cheap wine poured into expensive crystal glasses, mocking me as a corporate drone who supposedly failed at everything I touched. They convinced themselves I was some pathetic, struggling outcast who baked turkeys to earn their favor. Rachel thought she was a genius for stealing my outdated marketing plan, completely unaware that I had drafted that document as a deliberate trap to test her loyalty before offering her a massive executive position at my firm. She failed the test, traded her integrity for a momentary pat on the back, and sealed her own professional grave. They all had absolutely no idea that the woman they just humiliated on their front porch controlled a portfolio of assets that could buy and sell Richard's entire retirement fund 100 times over before breakfast. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing 3 layers of encrypted firewalls to access the Apex Holdings real estate division. I brought up the Pacific Northwest residential portfolio. Hundreds of luxury properties populated the screen. I scrolled past the penthouses in downtown Seattle and the massive waterfront estates in Bellevue, finally clicking on a specific residential trust file. The screen populated with the details of the exact mansion sitting 200 yards in front of me. 6 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a heated infinity pool, and a custom wine cellar. It was a beautiful piece of architecture, and I owned every single brick of it. A year ago, when Jamal was desperately searching for a property that would make him look like a successful tech mogul, his real estate agent approached one of my subsidiary management companies. Jamal signed the lease agreement blind, too arrogant to read the fine print, completely unaware that the landlord he was sending his monthly checks to was a corporate phantom designed to funnel money straight into my private accounts. I owned the roof over their heads. I owned the driveway where they parked their leased luxury cars. I even owned the very welcome mat I had just been standing on. But the real estate was just child's play. I switched tabs, opening the Apex Venture Capital terminal. A bright red folder blinked on the center of the screen labeled Priority Funding Disbursement. I clicked the file, opening the complete financial profile of Jamal's highly anticipated tech startup. The startup he had been boasting about all night. The company he claimed was going to change the world. I stared at the numbers, letting a cold, ruthless smile spread across my face. When Jamal first submitted his pitch deck to Apex Holdings 6 months ago, my analysts flagged it immediately. He was asking for a $5 million seed round, presenting himself as an innovative genius. But a basic forensic audit revealed the truth. His code was a stolen, recycled mess. His user acquisition numbers were completely fabricated through shadow accounts. He was operating a glorified Ponzi scheme, moving debt from one high-interest credit card to another, desperately trying to secure institutional funding before his entire house of cards collapsed. Any other venture capital firm would have rejected his proposal immediately and blacklisted him from the industry. But when I saw his name on the applicant list, I personally intervened. I instructed my executive board to approve the initial due diligence phases. I let Jamal pass the preliminary rounds. I let him sign the preliminary term sheets. I let him believe that he had actually fooled one of the most ruthless investment funds on the West Coast. I gave him the rope, and I let him tie the knot himself. He was throwing this massive Thanksgiving housewarming party to celebrate the final official wire transfer of those $5 million. He had invited investors, family members, and high society friends to witness his ultimate triumph. He needed that money to cover the 6 months of back rent he already owed my real estate company. He needed it to pay off the massive secret debts he had accumulated trying to impress my sister and my parents. I watched the digital clock on my laptop screen tick forward. It was exactly 8:15 in the evening. The party inside the mansion would be reaching its peak. The champagne would be flowing. The arrogant speeches would be happening right now. I hovered my mouse over the master override terminal. I had already given the verbal command to my chief financial officer, but I wanted the satisfaction of executing the final digital kill switch myself. I clicked the red icon labeled Terminate Funding Protocol. A loading bar flashed across the screen for a fraction of a second before a green confirmation box appeared. Transaction canceled. Account frozen. I closed the laptop with a satisfying sharp click. The trap was perfectly set. The doors were locked. There was absolutely no way out for any of them. I sat back in the dark, warm cabin of my vehicle, poured myself a cup of black coffee from my thermos, and kept my eyes fixed on the massive, glowing windows of the estate. I knew exactly what was about to happen next. I reopened my laptop, the screen flaring to life with the undeniable, irrefutable proof of Jamal's spectacular failure. The display split into multiple high-definition dashboards, painting a clinical picture of financial ruin. On the left side of the screen was the residential management ledger. The leasing agreement for the Pacific Northwest estate was a masterpiece of deception. When Jamal first applied to rent the mansion, he had submitted tax returns claiming an annual personal income of over $2 million. My forensic accounting artificial intelligence had shredded those documents in seconds. The reality was pathetic. Jamal had exactly $412 in his primary checking account. The monthly rent for that 6-bedroom mansion was $35,000. He had paid the first and last month using a high-interest bridge loan, and since then my property management subsidiary had received absolutely nothing. 6 full months of unpaid rent, late fees compounding on top of penalty charges. The eviction notices had been generated, legally processed, and were sitting in the queue waiting for my green light. Audrey had been posting daily video tours of the grand foyer showing off imported Italian marble and custom lighting fixtures, bragging to her hundreds of thousands of followers about her husband's incredible success. She was redecorating a house that was technically mine using credit cards that were maxed out to their absolute limits. She played the role of the wealthy tech wife, beautifully entirely oblivious to the fact that she was sleeping in a property owned by the sister she had just allowed to be banished into the freezing cold. On the right side of my screen was the Apex Venture Capital Terminal. Jamal called his startup a revolutionary artificial intelligence platform destined to disrupt the global logistics industry. His pitch deck was 50 pages of glossy buzzwords and empty promises. When my engineering team ran his code repository through our proprietary auditing software, the results were almost insulting. There was no revolutionary algorithm. It was an open-source script copied from a free developer forum, dressed up with a sleek user interface. The thousands of active daily users he bragged about in his investor meetings were bot accounts pinging servers he was renting on a free trial tier. He was bleeding cash, taking out predatory payday loans just to cover the server costs and keep the illusion alive for a few more weeks. He needed my $5 million not to grow a business, but to pay off his furious creditors and save himself from a mountain of legal trouble. He was operating a glorified Ponzi scheme, moving debt from one shadow lender to another. Jamal was driving a leased exotic sports car that was currently 3 payments past due. The repo agents were already tracking the GPS module. Audrey's massive diamond engagement ring, the one my mother constantly bragged about to her bridge club, was financed at a predatory interest rate that he had stopped paying 4 months ago. They were suffocating in a gilded cage of their own making. My mother Patricia had raised us to believe that perception was reality. She taught Audrey that if you look wealthy, people will treat you like royalty. That toxic philosophy had led my sister directly into the arms of a charismatic scam artist. Jamal recognized Audrey's desperate need for validation and used it to secure his place at my parents' dinner table. And my parents, blinded by their own greed and snobbery, welcomed him like a conquering hero. They looked at Jamal and saw the ultimate prize, a brilliant innovator who validated their social climbing ambitions. They looked at me and saw failure because I refused to play their superficial games. Yet the hard data on my glowing screen told the absolute truth. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not care about country club memberships, designer dresses, or pretentious Thanksgiving dinners. The numbers revealed that the golden child and her precious husband were nothing more than broke, desperate imposters dancing on the edge of a financial cliff. My mother had stood on that porch just minutes ago, telling me my appearance would ruin their high society image. She claimed Jamal was signing a monumental deal with elite investors. The irony was suffocating. The elite investor was sitting alone in a parked car holding the digital detonator to their entire fake life. Inside that warm, fragrant dining room, they were feasting on expensive catering and vintage wine, completely oblivious to the digital guillotine swinging down toward their necks. They believed their arrogance protected them. They believed their cruel dismissal of me at the front door was a victory. They had no idea they had just insulted the sole architect of their impending doom. Every bite of caviar they swallowed was funded by a lie. Every toast they made to their superior genes and brilliant business acumen was a joke written in red ink across my accounting ledgers. I watched the digital tracking system update in real time. My legal team had prepared the eviction execution orders. The local sheriff's department had already been briefed and placed on standby. The Venture Capital Fraud Division had drafted the official notification of contract termination, citing gross misrepresentation and malicious financial forgery. I had not just closed a door, I had triggered a controlled demolition. The sheer scale of their impending ruin was breathtaking. They were about to lose the mansion, the cars, the funding, and the fake prestige, all at the exact same moment. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid slide down my throat, grounding me in the present. The cold night air outside my armored SUV seemed to mirror the absolute chill in my veins. There was no sadness left in me. There was no pity. There was only the clinical, precise execution of consequences. I sat back in the dark watching the illuminated windows of the estate and waited for the first shockwave to hit. Inside the dining room, the atmosphere was thick with blind jubilation. Jamal stood at the head of the long mahogany table holding a crystal flute filled with vintage champagne. He tapped a silver spoon against the delicate glass, the sharp ringing sound demanding absolute silence from the wealthy guests and sycophantic family members gathered around him. Richard leaned back in his chair, beaming with misplaced pride, while Audrey gazed up at her husband with undisguised adoration. The rejection they had just handed me at the front door was already forgotten, brushed aside as a minor inconvenience on their path to absolute glory. To family, Jamal declared, his voice booming with the practiced confidence of a seasoned con artist. They say in the tech world that it takes a village to build a unicorn, but I say it takes a dynasty. Tonight we celebrate more than just this magnificent estate. We celebrate the future. By midnight, Apex Holdings is officially wiring $5 million into my company. We are not just making money, we are making history. The room erupted in thunderous applause. Uncle David whistled loudly, raising his glass high into the air. Patricia wiped a dramatic fake tear from her eye, turning to whisper to Rachel about how incredibly blessed they were to have such a visionary in the family. Audrey wrapped her arms around Jamal's neck, posing for a picture that someone was taking across the table. It was the absolute pinnacle of their collective ego. It was the exact moment they felt invincible. And then, slicing through the cheers and the clinking of expensive crystal, Jamal's phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood of the table. It was a harsh, jarring sound that cut through the soft jazz playing from the hidden speakers. He glanced down his custom velvet blazer, shifting as he reached for the device. The caller ID flashed bright red on the screen. It was Marcus, his chief financial officer. He was the only other person on the planet who knew the actual pathetic state of their company ledgers. Jamal frowned, a brief flash of annoyance crossing his handsome face. He hit the ignore button, sliding the phone into his pocket and turning his brilliant smile back to his captive audience. "Business never sleeps, folks," he joked smoothly. The crowd chuckled in appreciation of his supposed dedication. But less than 2 seconds later, the phone rang again. This time, it was accompanied by a string of rapid-fire text messages lighting up his lock screen. He pulled it out, intending to silence it completely, but the preview text caught his eye. "Urgent. Answer now." Apex pulled out. The arrogant smile on Jamal's face froze instantly. He picked up the device, excusing himself with a tight, unnatural nod. "One moment, please. I just need to finalize the wire transfer details with my team." He took 5 quick steps away from the main table, pressing the phone tightly to his ear. "Marcus, what is it?" "I am in the middle of my toast," he hissed, keeping his back turned to my parents so they could not read his lips. "It is gone, Jamal." The voice on the other end was frantic, breathless, echoing with absolute panic. Apex Holdings just executed an emergency termination protocol. The entire $5 million term sheet is voided. They pulled the plug. Jamal's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned pure white. "What are you talking about? That is impossible. The due diligence passed last week. Call their acquisitions director right now and fix this. Tell them we will renegotiate the equity split." "You do not understand," Marcus practically screamed through the receiver. "It is not a delay or a negotiation tactic. They audited the user acquisition logs. They ran a deep forensic check on the revenue reports you submitted last month. They know about the shadow accounts. They know the proprietary code is open source. They sent a formal notice of malicious financial forgery. Jamal, they contacted the authorities. The fraud division reported us to the police. I am resigning immediately. I am hiring a defense attorney, and do not ever contact me again." The line went completely dead. Jamal stood frozen, staring blankly at the expensive imported wallpaper in the hallway. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. His heart hammered wildly against his ribcage, threatening to break through his chest. The $5 million was gone. His company was dead. The police were coming. Everything he had built to impress my sister and my arrogant parents had just evaporated into thin air. "Darling, is everything all right?" Audrey's high-pitched voice broke through the deafening ringing in his ears. She had walked over to him, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his velvet shoulder. "Are they sending the wire early? We should pop the special vintage bottles." Jamal turned around slowly. The suave, untouchable tech mogul had completely vanished. Sweat beaded heavily on his forehead, catching the bright light from the chandelier overhead. His eyes darted frantically around the room, landing on the expensive catering, the lavish floral decorations, the eager faces of my parents waiting for good news. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. "It is..." Jamal stammered, his voice cracking pitifully as he tried to swallow the lump of terror in his throat. "It is just a small bank glitch. Nothing to worry about. Just a routing number error on their end." He tried to force a reassuring laugh, but it sounded like a strangled choke. Richard noticed the dramatic shift immediately. The seasoned, judgmental patriarch narrowed his eyes, setting his bourbon glass down heavily on the table. A bank glitch. For $5 million. That is highly unusual for an institution like Apex Holdings. Jamal, what exactly is going on here? You look like you just saw a ghost. Before Jamal could formulate another lie to pacify my father, his phone vibrated again. Then it buzzed a third time. Then a fourth. It was a relentless vibrating cascade of automated notifications. Alerts from his banking applications, credit card freezing notices, overdraft warnings from his secondary shadow accounts. The corporate systems were kicking in, locking down his remaining $400 as the financial entities flagged his entire existence for massive fraud. He shoved the phone deep into his pocket as if it were a live grenade, but it kept buzzing violently against his thigh. He wiped his sweating forehead with the back of his trembling hand. "I just need to make a quick call," he managed to say, stumbling backward and nearly knocking over a silver tray of champagne glasses resting on a side table. "I just need to step outside and clear this up with my broker." Audrey grabbed his arm tightly, her perfect smile slipping into genuine confusion and mounting embarrassment. "Jamal, you are sweating profusely. You are ruining your jacket. What is wrong with you? Stop acting so weird, everyone is watching us." She was right. The entire dining room had fallen completely silent. The jazz music played softly in the background, contrasting sharply with the sudden, suffocating tension that had gripped the luxurious space. Rachel stopped smirking and lowered her glass. Patricia clutched her pearls, looking between her husband and her son-in-law with wide, anxious eyes. Uncle David stopped laughing. Jamal looked at the lavish room he had rented, with lies surrounded by the family he had manipulated with fake prestige. He was suffocating. He tried to take a step toward the front door to escape the piercing stares, but his legs felt like lead. He could not run. He could not hide. The carefully constructed house of cards was collapsing in real time, and he was trapped squarely underneath the wreckage. Before Jamal could even force another breath into his lungs, 3 deafening aggressive pounds struck the grand mahogany front door. The sound echoed through the silent mansion like a cannon blast vibrating against the crystal chandeliers. Everyone in the dining room jumped. Jamal flinched so violently he nearly knocked over a silver platter. Richard stood up immediately, his face flushing with a potent mix of confusion and pure indignation. "Who in the world is beating on my door like a madman?" he demanded, looking at the hired waitstaff who were frozen against the walls. "I will not have this elegant evening interrupted by some delivery driver or lost tourist. Open the door and send them packing at once." A terrified caterer scurried to the foyer and unlocked the heavy door. It did not just open. It was pushed back with absolute uncompromising authority. Heavy combat boots stepped onto the imported Italian marble. 2 uniformed deputies from the county sheriff department marched directly into the grand entryway, their hands resting naturally near their duty belts. Right behind them walked a tall, sharp-featured woman in a tailored gray suit carrying a thick red leather folder. She moved with the cold, mechanical precision of a corporate executioner. The soft jazz music playing overhead was abruptly cut off by one of the deputies leaving the mansion in an eerie, ringing silence. Richard puffed out his chest, stepping forward to block their path into his daughter's supposed domain. "What is the meaning of this? You are trespassing on private property. This is a closed VIP event. I demand to know who is responsible for this outrageous intrusion." The woman in the gray suit did not even blink. She bypassed Richard entirely, stepping around him, as if he were a minor piece of ugly furniture, and marched straight into the grand dining room. She stopped at the head of the table, looking directly at Jamal, who was now trembling visibly, his complexion an ashen gray. "Are you Jamal Harrison?" she asked, her voice carrying clear and sharp across the room, ensuring every single wealthy investor, family member, and high society friend heard her. Jamal opened his mouth, but only a dry squeak came out. He nodded once, a jerky, pathetic movement. The woman unclasped her red folder and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents stamped with brilliant red ink. She slammed them down right in the center of the dining table, the heavy thud rattling the fine china and nearly tipping over a bottle of vintage champagne. "I am the senior legal representative for Apex Residential Properties," she announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You are being served with an immediate emergency notice of eviction. This property was secured using fraudulent financial documents, falsified tax returns, and fake bank statements. You are currently 6 months delinquent on your lease agreement, totaling over $200,000 in unpaid rent and compounding penalties." A collective gasp ripped through the dining room. Uncle David dropped his wine glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, dark red liquid pooling like blood, but nobody moved to clean it up. The wealthy investors Jamal had invited, the people he was desperately trying to impress, immediately began stepping away from the table, distancing themselves from the epicenter of a massive criminal scandal. Patricia gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning bone white. Her mouth hung open in absolute horror. She looked from the legal documents to the sheriff, then to her precious son-in-law. "What? What is she talking about, Jamal? Tell them this is a mistake. Tell them you own this house. You bought it in cash. You told us you paid in cash." The legal representative turned her cold gaze to my mother. "He does not own a single floorboard of this property, ma'am. He is a squatter who committed felony wire fraud to secure the lease. The actual owner of this estate has officially terminated the contract due to criminal misrepresentation." Audrey let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. She grabbed Jamal's velvet blazer, shaking his arm frantically. "Jamal, say something. Fix this. Call your bank. Call your lawyers. Tell these people to get out of our house." Jamal just stared at the eviction notice, his eyes wide and vacant. The tech visionary, the golden boy who was supposed to elevate my family into the stratosphere of the global elite, was reduced to a speechless, trembling fraud in front of everyone they had ever wanted to impress. Richard could not process the destruction of his ego. He stepped aggressively toward the deputies, his face purple with rage. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he roared, trying to summon the old authority he used to bully me and my mother. "I know the mayor. I know the chief of police. You cannot barge into a private residence on Thanksgiving and threaten my family with these baseless, slanderous accusations. I will have your badges for this. I will sue your entire department into bankruptcy." The lead deputy took a step forward, closing the distance, his physical presence easily overpowering my father's pathetic display of entitlement. "Sir, I suggest you lower your voice and step back." The deputy warned, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "This is a court-ordered eviction authorized by a federal judge. Mr. Harrison has been operating a fraudulent enterprise. We are not just here to serve papers. We are here to secure the premises and remove all occupants immediately. If you interfere with the execution of this court order, I will arrest you for obstruction of justice right here in front of your friends. Do I make myself clear?" Richard froze. The threat of being put in handcuffs in front of his elite social circle shattered his arrogance instantly. His shoulders slumped, his chest deflated, and the powerful patriarch who had blocked me at the front door just 30 minutes ago was completely emasculated. He looked around the room, realizing that the investors and country club friends were already pulling on their coats, whispering to each other as they hurried toward the back exit. They were fleeing the sinking ship, treating my family like a highly contagious disease. Patricia let out a loud, theatrical sob, burying her face in her hands. Her pearl necklace, the symbol of her manufactured wealth, seemed to choke her. The grand illusion was dead. Everyone in the room now knew the truth. They were not high society royalty. They were the pathetic victims of a cheap con artist, and they had paraded their own stupidity in front of the entire city. "You have exactly 2 hours to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises," the legal representative announced, checking her silver wristwatch. "Any items left behind after the deadline will be seized as collateral against the outstanding debt. The property will then be locked down and turned over to the authorities for a full criminal investigation." 2 hours. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Audrey dropped to her knees right there on the imported rug, sobbing uncontrollably into her designer silk dress. Rachel, who had been gloating about stealing my work just moments earlier, was shrinking into the shadows, her face pale with the realization that the elite family she had betrayed me for was actually completely destitute. The mansion that was supposed to be the monument to their superiority had instantly become their ultimate tomb. and I was sitting comfortably in my car outside watching the glorious collapse of their entire world. The absolute silence in the dining room shattered the moment the front door closed behind the fleeing investors. Audrey scrambled to her feet from the imported rug, her designer silk dress now wrinkled, and her perfect makeup ruined by streaks of mascara. She lunged at Jamal, her hands adorned with the massive unpaid diamond ring, clamped onto the lapels of his custom velvet blazer. She shook him with a surprising violent force. "You told me you bought this house in cash!" Audrey screamed, her voice cracking and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You looked me in the eye and said we owned this estate. You said the deed was in a private trust for our future children. Tell me she is lying, Jamal. Tell me that woman is a crazy, lying intruder." Jamal stumbled backward, his polished loafers slipping on the spilled red wine. He tried to peel Audrey's hands off his blazer, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. Sweat poured down his face, completely ruining his suave, untouchable aura. He looked like a cornered animal frantically searching the room for an escape route that did not exist. "Audrey, baby, listen to me, just calm down," Jamal stammered, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "It is a massive misunderstanding. A clerical error. These corporate management companies, they make administrative mistakes all the time. The wire transfer for the lease was supposed to go through my secondary holding account. My accountant must have missed the authorization deadline." "A clerical error," Richard roared, stepping forward and pointing a trembling finger right between Jamal's eyes. The older man's face was a dangerous shade of crimson. "A clerical error does not result in a federal eviction notice delivered by armed deputies during Thanksgiving dinner. A clerical error does not state that you owe $200,000 in back rent. You told me you were a multimillionaire, you arrogant fraud." Patricia, still clutching her pearls, let out a loud theatrical wail. "My friends," she sobbed, looking at the empty chairs where her high society guests had been sitting just moments ago. The country club president was at this table. The mayor's chief of staff was eating our caviar. "We are ruined, Richard. We can never show our faces in this city again. Our reputation is completely dead." Audrey ignored her mother's social panic, keeping her furious, tear-filled eyes locked entirely on her husband. She shoved him hard against the mahogany dining table. "I have been giving house tours to my followers. I have been bragging about our wealth to every single person I know, and you are a squatter. We do not even own the furniture in here." "I am going to fix this," Jamal shouted, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of his crumbling lies. He frantically patted his pockets, pulling out his sleek smartphone. His hands were shaking so violently, he almost dropped the device onto the floor. "I am going to call the primary investor, the head of Apex Holdings. We have a solid professional relationship. Once they process my $5 million funding round, I will buy this entire estate outright and fire that miserable property manager. I just need to get the chairman on the phone." Jamal stepped away from the furious circle of my family, holding the phone to his ear with trembling fingers. He paced back and forth across the dining room, completely unaware that his every move was being broadcasted to me through the massive illuminated floor-to-ceiling windows. 200 yards away, seated in the pitch-black cabin of my armored SUV, my secure corporate phone lit up. The caller ID flashed brightly on the dashboard screen. Jamal Harrison. I watched him through the glass. He was wiping sweat from his forehead, pacing frantically, his lips moving rapidly as he undoubtedly muttered desperate prayers. Inside the house, Audrey, Richard, and Patricia stood frozen, watching him with a toxic mixture of desperation and mounting rage. They were holding on to the absolute last shred of their delusional hope. They still desperately wanted to believe that Jamal was a misunderstood billionaire, that this was all just a temporary nightmare, and that their golden ticket to the elite class was about to save them. I stared at the glowing green accept button on my console. I could answer the phone. I could listen to him beg, listen to him fabricate another pathetic, elaborate lie about his financial situation. I could let him try to leverage his non-existent business acumen to secure a lifeline. Instead, I simply reached out and tapped the red button. Decline. Through the window, I saw Jamal pull the phone away from his ear, staring at the screen in absolute disbelief. He quickly tapped the screen again, redialing the number. My phone lit up a second time. I did not even let it ring fully. I tapped decline immediately. Jamal hit redial again, panic taking complete control of his motor functions. He was jabbing his finger into the glass screen with terrifying aggression. He paced faster, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. I opened my executive control panel and executed a hard block on his number, routing his desperate calls directly into an endless automated dead end. Inside the mansion, the realization finally hit him. He pulled the phone away from his face, listening to the harsh, unforgiving dial tone signaling a disconnected line. The automated empty beeping echoed the absolute void of his future. The primary investor was gone. The money was gone. The facade was permanently shattered. Well, Audrey demanded, her voice shrill and echoing with panic. What did they say? Are they sending the money? Jamal looked at his wife, then at my parents. The mask of the charismatic tech genius completely melted away, leaving only a broke, terrified con artist facing a prison sentence. They declined the call. He whispered, his voice completely hollow. The number has been disconnected. Audrey let out an agonizing scream of pure, unfiltered rage. You lied to me, she shrieked, lunging at him again, her fists pounding against his chest. You are broke. You have absolutely nothing. You used me to get to my family's connections. You told me I was marrying a king, and you are nothing but a pathetic lying parasite. I used you, Jamal suddenly snapped back, his own panic morphing into a vicious defensive rage. He grabbed her wrists, shoving her away from him. You drain my bank accounts dry every single month. You demand designer bags, 5-star vacations, and diamond rings I cannot afford, just so you can post pictures online to validate your miserable, empty existence. I went into massive debt trying to maintain the fake plastic lifestyle you and your snobby parents demanded. Richard stepped forward, raising a threatening fist. Do not you dare speak to my daughter that way, you worthless criminal. You deceived us all. You deceived yourselves, Richard. Jamal spat back, a bitter, hysterical laugh escaping his lips. You were so desperate to show off a billionaire son-in-law to your country club buddies that you never even bothered to run a background check on me. You saw the leased car, you saw the fancy suits, and you practically threw Audrey at me. You are all just as fake as I am. I sat in my car taking a slow sip of my coffee, watching the internal massacre unfold. The Golden family, the people who had stood on their front porch and told me my very existence was a stain on their perfect image, were now viciously tearing each other apart. The loyalty they constantly preached was evaporating in real time, replaced by venom, blame, and the terrifying reality of their immediate shared ruin. The 2-hour eviction countdown was ticking away, and they were wasting their precious minutes destroying whatever remained of their fractured family. I shifted my gaze from the vicious screaming match between my sister and her fake husband. My eyes tracked a smaller, much quieter figure attempting to slip out of the dining room. Rachel. She was hugging the shadows along the wall, clutching her designer coat tightly to her chest, desperately trying to tiptoe toward the side exit. She had seen the sinking ship. She recognized that the elite, wealthy family she had sold my decade of friendship to be part of was actually completely destitute. With armed deputies standing in the foyer and the illusion of high society shattered, Rachel decided to scurry away into the night to protect herself. I was not going to let her walk away that easily. I opened the communication terminal on my laptop. It was time to deal with the traitor. I typed a single command to the Executive Human Resources Director of Apex Global Media. It was the massive international communications conglomerate I had quietly acquired just 3 weeks ago. Rachel's supposedly prestigious boutique media agency was merely a microscopic asset in that massive corporate portfolio. I authorized the immediate release of a highly specific, legally ironclad termination package. I hit the send button and watched the mansion windows. Through the brightly lit glass, I observed the exact second the notification reached her. Rachel was reaching for the brass doorknob of the side exit when her phone lit up brightly in her hand. She paused, probably assuming it was an emergency text from one of her wealthy clients. She unlocked the screen. Even from 200 yards away, I could see her entire body stiffen. The email she was reading was a formal notice of immediate termination with extreme cause. It explicitly outlined gross professional misconduct, corporate fraud, and malicious intellectual property theft. I had attached a side-by-side digital forensics report to her termination letter. It compared the exact award-winning pitch she had submitted to her CEO against my original encrypted files, complete with metadata timestamps, proving I had authored every single word months before she claimed it as her own. The email did not just strip her of her six-figure salary and her coveted regional director title. It informed her that Apex Global Media was legally obligated to report her plagiarism to the National Industry Ethics Board. She was not just fired, she was professionally blacklisted. No reputable agency in the country would ever hire a proven intellectual property thief. I watched Rachel's phone slip from her trembling fingers and clatter against the hardwood floor. She dropped to her knees, her hands flying to her mouth to muffle a scream. Her entire identity, her arrogant pride, and her stolen career had just been completely vaporized. She had massive credit card debt from desperately trying to keep up with Audrey's fake luxurious lifestyle. She had leased a luxury apartment she could only afford because of that stolen promotion. Without that job, she was financially ruined. Blind panic took over. She scrambled to retrieve her phone and sprinted frantically back into the center of the dining room, completely ignoring the armed deputies. She shoved past my mother and threw herself at Audrey. I watched the interaction unfold with absolute cinematic clarity. Rachel grabbed Audrey's arms, crying hysterically, her mascara running down her face in thick black streaks. She was begging. I could easily read the desperate movements of her mouth. She was pleading with my sister for help, asking for a loan, begging Audrey to use her social media influencer status to save her reputation. Rachel actually believed that her loyalty to the golden child would be rewarded in her moment of absolute crisis. Audrey's reaction was a masterclass in narcissistic cruelty. My sister was already in a state of unhinged meltdown over losing her mansion and her fake billionaire husband. When Rachel grabbed her, Audrey looked at her former best friend as if she had just stepped in something vile on the sidewalk. Audrey violently yanked her arms away, pushing Rachel backward with brutal force. Even through the glass, Audrey's vicious body language spoke volumes. She was screaming at Rachel, pointing her finger aggressively toward the door. "Are you insane? We are being thrown onto the street by armed guards, and you are asking me for money." Audrey was verbally destroying her. I knew exactly how my sister operated when she was backed into a corner. She attacked the weakest person in the room to regain a false sense of control. Audrey stripped away every delusion Rachel had about their friendship. She made it blatantly clear that Rachel was nothing more than a pathetic hanger on a desperate leech who only hung around for free champagne and proximity to wealth. Audrey had never respected Rachel. She had only kept her around because having a desperate follower stroked her own massive ego. Now that Rachel had lost her job and her usefulness, Audrey discarded her without a second of hesitation. Rachel stood frozen in the center of the dining room, utterly humiliated. The wealthy guests who were still attempting to gather their coats stared at her with open disgust. My mother, Patricia, physically turned her back on Rachel, refusing to even make eye contact with a woman who had just been exposed as a jobless fraud. The fake friendship they had built over my emotional corpse was tearing itself to bloody shreds. The lead sheriff deputy finally stepped in, ending the spectacle. He pointed firmly toward the front door, instructing all non-residents to leave the premises immediately so the formal eviction protocol could proceed. Rachel had no choice. She picked up her cheap knockoff designer coat from a chair, her shoulders shaking with heavy, humiliating sobs. She walked the walk of shame past my glaring parents, past her furious former best friend, and out the grand mahogany front doors. I watched from the warm, dark cabin of my SUV as Rachel stumbled down the long, freezing driveway. The biting Seattle wind whipped her hair across her tear-stained face. She clutched her dead phone, completely stripped of her career, her stolen social status, and her dignity. She had betrayed my decade of genuine loyalty for a seat at a table of vipers, and the vipers had just eaten her alive. I took another slow sip of my coffee, feeling an immense, profound sense of justice as she disappeared alone into the freezing dark night. Inside the mansion, the bloodbath was far from over. The lead deputy had cleared the immediate area of the remaining stragglers, leaving only my core biological family trapped in the center of the grand dining room. The room that was supposed to be the monument to their elite status had transformed into a sterile holding cell. I adjusted the audio feed coming through my laptop, a perk of owning the security infrastructure wired into the smart home system of the estate. Every desperate breath, every panicked whisper was piped directly into the quiet cabin of my SUV in crystal-clear high-definition audio. The woman in the tailored gray suit, my senior legal representative, was not finished. She snapped her red leather folder shut, the sharp sound cutting through the heavy breathing of my panicked relatives. But instead of stepping back to let the deputies proceed with the physical removal, she reached into her sleek briefcase and pulled out a second, significantly thicker manila envelope. She turned her cold, calculating gaze away from the trembling, defeated Jamal and locked eyes directly with my father. Richard immediately puffed out his chest, desperately trying to salvage whatever microscopic shred of patriarchal authority he thought he still possessed. He adjusted his silk tie, his face twisting into a mask of pure indignation. "Do not look at me," Richard barked, waving his hand toward Jamal. "I am merely a guest in this house. I have absolutely zero legal ties to this man's fraudulent business ventures or his catastrophic leasing agreements. I demand that you allow my wife and me to gather our coats and leave this circus immediately. We have been victimized by this criminal just like you have." The legal representative did not flinch. She stepped forward, her heels clicking methodically against the hardwood floor, and dropped the heavy manila envelope directly onto my father's empty dinner plate. "You are not a guest, Richard," she stated, her voice devoid of any human empathy. "You are the primary financial guarantor. You have been officially served." Richard scoffed loudly, a harsh, arrogant sound that echoed in the silent room. "That is completely absurd. I never signed anything. I am a retired, respected member of this community. I would never tether my pristine financial portfolio to a rental property." The representative calmly opened the envelope and extracted a crisp, heavily notarized legal contract with multiple colorful verification seals. She slid it across the mahogany table until it rested right beneath my father's nose. I sat in my car, smiling at the glowing screen of my laptop. I remembered the exact day that document crossed my desk 6 months ago. When Jamal's initial credit check failed the screening for this $35,000 a month mansion, his application was automatically flagged for rejection. He needed a co-signer with substantial verified assets. Jamal had played my father like a cheap fiddle. He convinced Richard that the venture capital funding was just weeks away, framing the lease as a minor temporary hurdle. Richard, blinded by his desperate, pathetic hunger to be the patriarch of a powerful tech dynasty, wanted a piece of the pie. He wanted a seat on Jamal's future board of directors. So behind my mother's back, Richard signed a comprehensive guarantor agreement. Richard looked down at the paper. Through the surveillance feed, I could hear his breathing completely stop. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. There on the bottom line was his unmistakable, sweeping signature. Patricia grabbed the document from his shaking hands. She scanned the bold legal text, her eyes darting frantically across the page. Her face, previously flushed with anger at Jamal, suddenly drained of all color. She looked as if she had been physically struck by a freight train. "Richard, what is this?" Patricia gasped, her voice trembling so violently it cracked. "What did you do? Why is our home address listed under the collateral section?" The legal representative answered before my father could formulate a lie. "In order to secure this luxury lease and the subsequent bridge loans Mr. Harrison utilized to furnish this property, a guarantor was required. Your husband legally pledged your fully paid-off retirement estate as collateral to underwrite Mr. Harrison's debts. Because the primary leaseholder is in total default, the liability has transferred entirely to the guarantor." Patricia gripped the edge of the table to keep her legs from buckling beneath her. "What does that mean? What are you saying?" "It means," the representative replied with brutal clinical precision, "that the outstanding debt currently exceeds $800,000 when factoring in the defaulted lease. the massive penalty fees, and the unpaid luxury lines of credit tied to this agreement. Because the debt is severely delinquent, our partnered financial institutions initiated the collection process this morning. Foreclosure notices on your primary residence were officially filed with the county court at 9 o'clock today. The bank is seizing your home, Patricia. You have lost everything. A guttural, agonizing scream ripped from my mother's throat. It was the sound of a woman whose entire identity, social standing, and financial security had just been detonated. She turned on my father with a ferocious, animalistic rage. "You signed away our house?" she shrieked, slamming her fists into Richard's chest. "You secretly mortgaged the home we worked 30 years to pay off for him, for this worthless, lying street rat." Richard stumbled backward, raising his arms to shield his face from his wife's frantic blows. "Patricia, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "Jamal swore it was only for 30 days. He promised me 10 times the return on investment when the Apex funding came through. He showed me the fake corporate bank statements. He said I was going to be a multimillionaire. I was trying to secure our legacy." "Your legacy!" Patricia screamed, her pearl necklace snapping as she grabbed his collar, sending dozens of expensive white beads scattering across the floor. "You arrogant, stupid old man. We are homeless. We are completely bankrupt. The country club is going to laugh us out of the city. We have absolutely nothing left." Audrey tried to step between her warring parents, holding her hands up in a desperate attempt to play the peacemaker. "Mom, please stop hitting him. We can fix this. Jamal can call his lawyers. We will sue the company. We will figure it out." Patricia violently slapped Audrey's hands away. She looked at her golden child, the daughter she had worshipped and praised my entire life, with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "Do not touch me," Patricia spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You brought this criminal into our family. You were so obsessed with playing the rich housewife online that you married a broke, lying scammer. You paraded him around, you enabled his lies, and you let him steal your parents' life savings. You are just as much of a fraud as he is." Audrey burst into hysterical, hyperventilating tears, sinking to the floor amid the scattered pearls and shattered wine glasses. Jamal stood frozen in the corner, absolutely silent, knowing that if he spoke a single word, my father might actually kill him. I leaned back in the driver's seat of my SUV, taking it all in. The sweet, intoxicating rush of absolute justice washed over me. For 32 years, Patricia and Richard had worshipped the illusion of wealth. They had emotionally abused me, cast me aside, and treated me like a repulsive failure simply because I valued hard work over their shallow, pretentious social climbing. They had stood on that very porch an hour ago and banished me into the freezing cold because I did not fit their aesthetic. Now the toxic empire they valued above their own flesh and blood had imploded, crushing them under its weight. They had traded their loyal, successful daughter for a shiny, fake gold coin that turned out to be a ticking bomb. They had blindly trusted a charismatic liar, and in their insatiable greed, they had willingly signed the death warrant on their own comfortable, privileged lives. They were bankrupt. They were facing imminent homelessness. They were publicly humiliated beyond any hope of recovery. And the absolute best part was that they still had no idea that the executioner who just wiped them off the financial map was sitting quietly in the dark, watching the magnificent, chaotic finale of their own making. The final stragglers in the dining room finally broke from their stunned paralysis. Uncle David, who just an hour ago had been barking with loud, arrogant laughter at my expense, was suddenly terrified of being associated with a federal fraud investigation. He stumbled over the broken wine glass on the floor, not even bothering to apologize or offer assistance to his distraught sister. He grabbed his heavy winter coat from the foyer closet, practically sprinting out the front door without a single backward glance. The remaining high society friends followed suit in a chaotic, desperate stampede. Women in expensive gowns tripped over their own heels to escape the mansion. The hired caterers abandoned their silver serving trays, slipping silently through the kitchen exit, leaving half-eaten plates of roasted duck and caviar to rot on the table. In less than 2 minutes, the grand estate was entirely emptied of its audience, leaving only the core toxic unit to face their absolute destruction. Inside the dining room, Audrey slowly pulled herself up from the floor. The hysterical sobbing that had racked her body just moments ago morphed into something dark, feral, and utterly unrecognizable. Her designer silk dress was stained with spilled wine, and her perfect curls were a tangled, frizzy mess. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, her eyes locking onto Jamal with a terrifying, hollow intensity. She closed the distance between them in 3 rapid steps. The slap was deafening. It cracked through the vast, quiet room like a gunshot. Audrey struck Jamal across the face with so much unbridled force that her heavy diamond engagement ring tore a jagged red scratch across his cheek. Jamal's head snapped sharply to the side. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his bleeding face, but Audrey did not stop. She launched herself at him, her manicured nails clawing wildly at his face and chest. "You ruined my life," she shrieked, her voice tearing her throat raw. "You took away my future. You humiliated me in front of everyone I know. You are a disgusting, pathetic nobody." Seeing his golden daughter physically attack her husband finally shattered the last remaining fragment of Richard's self-control. The polished, arrogant patriarch who had sneered at me on the front porch completely vanished, replaced by a desperate, violent old man who had just lost his entire life savings. With a feral roar, Richard charged across the room. He shoved Audrey aside and lunged directly at Jamal. Richard's thick, heavy hands grabbed the lapels of Jamal's custom velvet blazer, twisting the expensive fabric into tight fists. Richard slammed the younger man backward against the wall with surprising strength, the impact rattling the framed artwork hanging nearby. "You stole my retirement!" Richard screamed, spit flying from his mouth and landing on Jamal's terrified face. "I worked for 30 years. I built a legacy. I trusted you with my home, and you signed it away like a common street thief. I will kill you with my bare hands. I will tear you apart." Jamal, trapped against the wall and bleeding from his cheek, stopped trying to apologize. The cornered rat finally bared its teeth. He shoved his hands against Richard's chest, fighting back with sudden, desperate aggression. He shoved the older man hard, sending Richard stumbling back into the edge of the dining table. "Do not act like a victim." Jamal spat, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. "You did not sign those papers because you loved me, Richard. You signed them because you are a greedy, pathetic old man who wanted to piggyback on my supposed success. You thought I was your golden ticket to the billionaire boys club. You sold out your own daughter, you sold out your own morals, and you sold out your own house just so you could brag to the other snobs at the golf course. You deserve this. You deserve to lose every single penny." Patricia, watching her husband nearly collapse against the table, let out an ear-piercing shriek of rage. She did not direct her fury at Jamal. Instead, the ultimate toxic mother turned her venom entirely onto her favorite child. She grabbed Audrey by the shoulders, shaking her violently. "This is your fault," Patricia screamed, her eyes bulging with madness. "You were supposed to secure a wealthy husband. I taught you how to spot real money. I taught you how to secure our family's position in society. You were too stupid to see he was a fraud. You were too obsessed with his leased cars and his fake watches. You dragged this parasite into our home and let him destroy us." Audrey ripped herself out of her mother's grip, her face contorting with absolute hatred. "Do not blame this on me," she roared back, pointing an accusatory finger right between Patricia's eyes. "You forced me to marry him. You pressured me every single day. You told me Jamal was my ticket to elite society. You cared more about the wedding photos and the country club gossip than you ever cared about me. You built this fake life, Mom. You raised me to be a gold digger, and now you are mad because I dug in the wrong mine." The illusion of their perfect, loving family had completely vaporized. There was no loyalty. There was no unconditional love. There was no bond. Underneath the designer clothes and the polished smiles, they were just vicious, self-serving predators who only valued each other based on what they could extract. Now that the money was gone and the prestige was shattered, they turned on each other with the speed and brutality of starving wolves. The lead sheriff deputy, who had been watching the chaotic melee from the arched doorway, finally stepped in. He rested his hand firmly on his utility belt and projected his voice over the screaming match. "That is enough," the deputy commanded, his booming voice halting the physical violence instantly. "If anyone lays another hand on another person in this house, I will skip the eviction process and take you all straight to the county jail for domestic assault. You have exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes left to pack your personal belongings. I suggest you stop screaming and start putting your things in garbage bags, because when that clock hits 0, you are leaving this property whether you are fully dressed or not. The threat of immediate incarceration finally silenced them. Audrey collapsed against the grand staircase, sobbing into her hands. Patricia dropped to her knees, clutching her chest as she stared blankly at the scattered pearls on the floor. Richard leaned heavily against the dining table, gasping for air, looking like a broken, hollow shell of a man. Jamal stood frozen in the corner, holding his bleeding cheek, realizing he was entirely alone in the world. I sat in my armored SUV, the blue light of the laptop screen casting a cold glow over my face. The audio feed transmitted their heavy, defeated breathing directly into the quiet cabin of my car. They had spent decades tearing me down, convincing me I was a failure because I did not fit their superficial mold. Now they had done the hardest part of my job for me. They had completely destroyed themselves. I watched them scatter in different directions to begin packing whatever pathetic scraps they could carry, and I allowed myself a genuine peaceful smile. The ensuing hour and 45 minutes was a masterclass in pathetic, disorganized panic. Through the surveillance cameras, I watched them scramble like rodents on a sinking ship. Audrey was hysterically trying to shove dozens of designer shoes and bulky silk dresses into a single monogrammed suitcase. She completely ignored practical items like heavy winter coats or thermal blankets, utterly incapable of grasping the terrifying reality that she was about to be homeless in freezing weather. Patricia was frantically wrapping her remaining intact pearl necklaces and silver trinkets in discarded Thanksgiving napkins, prioritizing her superficial status symbols over anything remotely useful. Richard paced the master bedroom, shoving unread legal documents and useless country club membership cards into his leather briefcase, his hands shaking so violently he kept dropping papers across the hardwood floor. Jamal was nowhere near them. He had locked himself in the downstairs guest bathroom, frantically stuffing his own luxury watches and whatever loose cash he could find into a duffel bag. He was clearly preparing to abandon his fake wife the second they hit the pavement. When the timer hit 0, the lead sheriff deputy did not offer a single second of grace. He unclipped his radio, signaled his partner, and began marching through the estate. "Time is up," his voice boomed down the grand hallway. "Drop whatever does not fit in those bags and move to the front exit right now. Anyone still inside this property in exactly 2 minutes will be arrested for criminal trespassing." Richard tried to pull rank one last desperate time. He stood at the top of the grand staircase, his face flushed and sweating profusely despite the chilling atmosphere. "Officer, I demand an extension. We are elderly citizens. You cannot throw us out into the freezing cold on a national holiday. We need at least another hour to arrange transportation." The deputy did not even break his stride. He pointed a firm, uncompromising finger toward the front door. "The court order does not care about holidays, sir. You had months to pay your rent. Move your feet, or I will put you in handcuffs and carry you out myself." The absolute humiliation of their exit was a beautiful poetic symmetry. Just hours ago, my father had stood in that exact grand foyer, blocking my entry, sneering at my homemade turkey and telling me I was a stain on their pristine image. Now he was being herded out of that same door like a common criminal. Patricia stumbled down the front steps, her high heels catching on the freezing stone. She clutched a garbage bag filled with designer purses to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Audrey followed closely behind, dragging a massive overstuffed suitcase with a broken wheel. The expensive silk dress she had flaunted all evening offered absolutely zero protection against the biting Seattle wind. She shivered violently, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest, her makeup completely ruined by a steady stream of tears. Jamal slinked out last, keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact with the furious family he had just bankrupted. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them. The deadbolt clicked with a loud, final, echoing snap. The deputy stood on the porch, watching silently as the family dragged their pathetic belongings down the long, illuminated driveway. They reached the curb and stopped. There were no luxury town cars waiting for them. The valet service had fled hours ago. The repo agents had already flagged Jamal's leased sports car, and Richard had taken an Uber to the party, assuming he would be staying in the guest wing for the long holiday weekend. They had absolutely nowhere to go. I sat in the heated leather interior of my armored SUV, the engine purring softly, providing a cocoon of perfect warmth. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, my eyes locked on the miserable scene unfolding just 200 yards away. It was a freezing, unforgiving Thanksgiving night. The temperature was dropping rapidly, hovering just above freezing. Frost was already beginning to form on the manicured lawns of the gated community. And there they stood, the elite superior family. They huddled together under the harsh glare of the streetlights, shivering uncontrollably in their thin velvet blazers and ruined silk dresses. Patricia was crying loudly, leaning against a street lamp for support, looking like a discarded extra from a tragic play. Richard was desperately tapping at his phone with freezing, stiff fingers, trying to find a hotel that would accept a maxed-out credit card on a holiday night. Audrey was screaming at Jamal again, her voice carried by the bitter wind, but he just stared blankly at the dark pavement, completely unresponsive. Inside the mansion, the lavish feast they had abandoned was growing cold on the mahogany table. The vintage champagne was going flat. The caviar was spoiling. They had sacrificed their own daughter for a seat at that table, only to be cast out into the freezing street before they could even finish their meal. They looked absolutely pathetic. They had traded their loyal, loving daughter for the illusion of wealth, and the universe had rewarded them with the exact fate they deserved. I watched them shivering on the curb, surrounded by their useless designer luggage, completely stripped of their dignity, their home, and their future. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt the profound, unmatched peace of absolute justice. The visual contrast between their unbridled arrogance at the front door and their miserable reality on the curb was the sweetest dessert I could have ever asked for. I reached for the gear shift, perfectly content to leave them standing in the dark, freezing ruins of their own making. I shifted into drive and let the heavy tires of the SUV roll smoothly over the freezing asphalt. I did not look in the rearview mirror. They were no longer my problem. The morning sun broke through the gray Seattle overcast exactly 9 hours later. While I was enjoying a perfectly brewed espresso in my penthouse overlooking the Puget Sound, my family was waking up to the harsh, unforgiving reality of a cheap roadside motel. Patricia had apparently begged a desk clerk to run her final, barely viable emergency credit card, just to secure a 2-star room with peeling wallpaper and a heater that rattled loudly. They had spent the night crammed into 2 double beds, wearing the same ruined formal wear from the disaster of a Thanksgiving dinner. But arrogance is a stubborn disease. Even sleeping on scratchy polyester sheets, Richard convinced himself that this was merely a temporary illegal inconvenience. By 10 o'clock that morning, Richard had marched his exhausted, disheveled family into the pristine downtown offices of his longtime corporate attorney, Gregory Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell had handled Richard's business affairs for 2 decades. Richard slammed his fist on the polished glass conference table, his voice hoarse from screaming in the freezing wind the night before. He demanded immediate injunctions. He demanded a massive civil lawsuit against Apex Holdings for wrongful eviction, emotional distress, and breach of contract. He wanted the sheriff's department investigated. He wanted blood. Patricia sat beside him, clutching a cheap paper coffee cup, nodding frantically, while Audrey completely ignored Jamal, who was sitting as far away from her as possible at the opposite end of the long table. Mr. Mitchell did not match Richard's aggressive, fiery energy. The older attorney looked physically ill. He sat behind his desk, rubbing his temples, a thick stack of printed financial documents resting heavily in front of him. "Richard, you need to sit down and stop yelling," Mitchell said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual confident legal swagger. "I spent the entire night tracking the corporate structures behind Apex Holdings and the property management subsidiary that holds the lease to that mansion. I pulled the state registry files, the corporate tax filings, and the ultimate beneficiary ownership disclosures. You cannot sue them, Richard. You have absolutely no legal standing, and even if you did, you would be fighting a thermonuclear war with a water pistol." Richard scoffed, his face turning an angry shade of red. Nonsense. They are a faceless corporate entity that illegally threw my family onto the street. I want the name of the CEO. I want the chairman of the board. I will drag them through deposition hell until they beg to settle out of court. Just give me the name of the bastard running Apex Holdings. Mitchell let out a long, heavy sigh. He picked up the top document, a certified state incorporation charter, and slid it across the glass table. It stopped right in front of Richard's trembling hands. You do not need a deposition to speak to the chairman, Richard. You just need her cell phone number. Richard looked down. Patricia leaned over his shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she tried to focus on the bold black ink at the bottom of the signature page. Audrey stopped glaring at Jamal and looked at her parents. The silence that engulfed the conference room was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens right before an airplane hits the ground. Richard's breathing stopped. His eyes locked onto the name printed clearly under the title of sole managing member and chief executive officer. Claire. My name. The name of the daughter he had physically blocked from entering a house that she legally owned. This is a fake! Richard gasped, his voice barely a whisper. He pushed the paper away as if it were coated in acid. This is some kind of sick, elaborate prank. Claire is a low-level desk worker. She bakes turkeys. She drives a cheap car. She does not own a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. Mitchell shook his head slowly, his expression full of grim pity. It is not a fake, Richard. I verified it through 3 different federal databases. Claire is the architect behind Apex Holdings. She acquired the real estate firm last year. She approved the venture capital term sheet that your son-in-law applied for. She is the one who ordered the funding pulled last night. She is the one who triggered the eviction. The entire corporate structure belongs exclusively to her. She is a billionaire, Richard. Patricia let out a strangled, suffocating gasp. She grabbed the edge of the glass table, her knuckles turning bone white. Her mind was frantically trying to perform impossible mental gymnastics, desperately trying to rewrite reality. No. Patricia stammered, her voice shaking violently. No, Jamal must have put her name on the documents to hide his assets. Jamal used her as a dummy corporation. Tell them, Jamal. Tell them you own it. Jamal looked up from the end of the table. His bruised, scratched face was completely devoid of hope. He let out a dark, miserable laugh. I do not own anything, Patricia. I begged Apex for that money. I practically groveled. I had no idea your loser daughter was the one holding the leash. She played all of us. She watched me brag about my company while knowing she held the absolute power to destroy it with a single keystroke. Audrey gripped her hair, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. The realization hit her like a physical strike to the chest. The sister she had mocked, the woman she had looked down upon her entire life, was the actual billionaire she had been pretending to be married to. All the designer clothes, all the luxury cars, all the elite status she craved, Claire actually possessed it all. And they had just spent the last 10 years treating her like absolute garbage. Mitchell leaned forward, folding his hands together. Richard, you need to understand the gravity of this situation. Claire does not just own the house you were evicted from. She holds the guarantor agreement you signed. She legally owns the debt you took on for Jamal. She has the absolute right to seize your retirement accounts, your pension, and your primary residence. She is your largest creditor. You are entirely at her mercy. Patricia began to weep heavy, ugly sobs that distorted her face. But she is our daughter. She would never take her own parents home. She is just throwing a tantrum because she felt left out of the party. She will forgive us once she calms down. Mitchell looked at Patricia with a mixture of disbelief and professional detachment. Patricia, your daughter did not throw a tantrum. She executed a perfectly legal, highly coordinated corporate strike that decimated your entire family's financial standing in less than 60 seconds. She does not want an apology. She wants absolute destruction. The sheer terror finally began to set into Richard's eyes. The arrogant bluster completely vanished, replaced by the suffocating realization of his own actions. He had literally handed the deed of his life savings over to the daughter he had ruthlessly abused and abandoned. They sat in that sterile conference room, trapped in the inescapable prison of their own making. There was no one else to blame. There was no legal loophole. The scapegoat they had kicked out into the cold was actually the supreme ruler of their financial universe, and they had just handed her the perfect legal justification to completely wipe them off the map. Jamal never even made it back to the motel with them. The second he stepped out of the attorney's office and onto the downtown sidewalk, two federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division stepped out of an unmarked vehicle. Handcuffs clicked sharply around his wrists. His Miranda rights were read aloud in the middle of the crowded street, and the fake tech mogul was hauled off to a holding cell before my father could even process what was happening. Without their fraudulent golden boy, the remaining three members of my family hailed a cab and headed straight for the financial district. They stood on the bustling sidewalk, craning their necks to stare up at the towering 70-story glass monolith that housed the global headquarters of Apex Holdings. Richard stormed through the heavy revolving doors, aggressively adjusting his wrinkled, wine-stained suit jacket. He desperately tried to project his old booming authority as he marched up to the polished marble security desk. He demanded an immediate audience with the chief executive officer, speaking to the guards as if they were his personal servants. The security personnel, massive men in tailored black suits, did not ask for identification. They already had strict instructions. They simply swiped a master key card and directed my disheveled family to a private express elevator that shot straight up to the executive penthouse level. When the elevator doors slid open, they stepped directly into my domain. The top floor was a fortress of silent, intimidating power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, dizzying view of the entire Seattle skyline. My executive assistant, a sharp-eyed woman with flawless professional composure, did not offer them water or ask them to take a seat in the waiting area. She simply escorted them straight into my private boardroom. I was seated at the head of a massive obsidian conference table, sipping a fresh espresso. I did not stand up to greet them. I did not offer a polite smile. I just watched them file into the room, looking like a band of exhausted, panicking refugees who had completely lost their grip on reality. Patricia did not miss a beat. The sheer scale of my wealth and the intimidating environment of the corporate boardroom did not humble her in the slightest. Instead, her narcissistic survival instincts kicked into overdrive. She slammed her cheap synthetic leather purse onto the polished table, her eyes flashing with indignant rage. "How could you do this to your own sister?" Patricia shrieked, instantly attempting to cast me as the malicious villain. "You set a trap. You deliberately lured Jamal into taking that money just to humiliate us. You watched us planning the housewarming, you watched Audrey decorating the nursery, and you sat there in silence plotting to destroy our family from the shadows." I placed my espresso cup down gently on a cork coaster. I did not say a word, allowing her toxic delusion to fill the massive room. "Family is everything." Claire Patricia continued, slamming her hand against her chest, as if she were a wounded martyr. "You have more money than you could ever spend in 10 lifetimes, and you chose to throw your own parents onto the freezing street just to settle some petty, pathetic childhood grudge. You need to call the police right now, drop the fraud charges against Jamal, and sign the deed to that mansion over to your sister. You must save our house. It is your absolute duty as a daughter." Audrey stepped out from behind our mother, her eyes swollen and red from crying all night. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her face contorting with bitter resentment. "You were just jealous." Audrey spat, her voice shrill and desperate. "You have always been jealous of me because I found a handsome husband and you are alone. You orchestrated this entire eviction because you could not stand seeing me happy in a house you knew you owned." Audrey leaned over the table, tears of entitlement streaming down her face. "You ruined my life online. My followers saw the police cars. The gossip blogs are already posting about the eviction. You have to fix my reputation right now. I want you to put out a corporate press release from this company saying this was all a massive administrative mistake. Tell them Jamal is a consultant for your firm. Give him the $5 million so he can post bail and save my brand." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, absolutely fascinated by the depth of their delusion. They had lost everything. They were facing criminal investigations, bankruptcy, and public disgrace. Yet they still possessed the sheer, unadulterated audacity to march into my corporate headquarters and demand that I finance their fake lifestyle. They showed absolutely zero remorse for abandoning me at the front door just hours earlier. They felt no guilt for the decades of emotional abuse. They were simply angry that their designated punching bag had suddenly become the bank. Richard stepped forward, slamming his fists on the obsidian table, trying to summon the patriarchal roar that used to terrify me when I was a teenager. He completely ignored the fact that he was currently standing in a building I owned, negotiating with the primary creditor holding the deed to his retirement. "I am still your father!" Richard growled, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "And I will not be treated like a beggar by my own flesh and blood. I expect you to tear up that guarantor agreement right this second. I expect you to clear my retirement estate of all financial liens before the banks open tomorrow morning. And I expect a profound apology for the massive disrespect you showed us last night. You are going to fix this entire mess, Claire. You will transfer the funds, you will drop the eviction, and you will save this family, or you will be completely dead to us forever." They stood there, a unified front of toxic entitlement, breathing heavily and waiting for me to break. They were using the exact same psychological warfare they had utilized my entire life. They deployed guilt manipulation and the threat of withdrawing their conditional love to force me into submission. They truly believed that deep down I was still the desperate, insecure little girl who would do absolutely anything to earn their approval. They thought they could bully a billionaire chief executive officer into handing over a fortune just by playing the family card. The absolute silence in the boardroom seemed to unnerve Audrey. She had always relied on immediate volatile reactions, feeding off the emotional chaos she created to manipulate every situation. When I did not immediately flinch, defend myself, or offer a tearful apology, she switched her tactics. The aggressive pointing finger dropped. Her shoulders slumped forward and her face crumpled into a mask of exaggerated theatrical agony. She collapsed heavily into one of the plush leather guest chairs, burying her face in her hands and letting out loud, gasping sobs that echoed sharply off the floor to ceiling glass walls. "It is because you are completely empty inside," Audrey wailed, peeking through her perfectly manicured fingers to ensure I was watching her performance. "You have all this money, all this corporate power, but you are absolutely miserable. You have always been insanely jealous of me, Claire. You are jealous because Mom and Dad actually love me. You are jealous because I am beautiful and popular and people actually want to be around me. You set this entire elaborate trap because you cannot stand the fact that even with billions of dollars, no one will ever truly love you the way Jamal loves me." She slammed her fist against the leather armrest, her voice rising to a shrill, piercing pitch that grated against the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. "You just want to drag me down to your pathetic level. You want me to be a miserable, lonely spinster just like you. You engineered this whole financial disaster to destroy my happiness because you are fundamentally broken. You are a sociopath, Claire. You need serious psychiatric help, not a corporate empire." Patricia immediately rushed to Audrey's side. She wrapped her arms protectively around her golden child, glaring at me with supreme, weaponized maternal judgment. "She is absolutely right," Patricia declared, her voice dripping with toxic pity. "We have always known there was something deeply wrong with you, Claire. You lacked basic human empathy even as a little girl. You hoarded your toys. You never wanted to share the spotlight. Now you are hoarding unimaginable wealth while your own flesh and blood faces the freezing streets. It is a literal sickness." Patricia shook her head, looking at me as if I were a tragic disease specimen. "If you had just come to us, if you had just been honest about your financial success, instead of hiding like a coward, we could have helped you. We could have integrated you into high society properly. We could have helped you find a husband who tolerates your difficult personality. Instead, you isolated yourself and let this bitter, twisted jealousy rot your brain until you did the unthinkable." I sat perfectly still, listening to them spin their elaborate, delusional narrative. They were actively rewriting history right in front of my eyes, projecting their own shallow materialistic obsessions entirely onto me. In their minds, my financial independence was a symptom of mental illness, and their parasitic greed was a righteous virtue. They genuinely believed that their presence in my life was a grand prize I should be willing to purchase for $800,000. Audrey wiped her nose with the back of her hand. her crying instantly subsiding as she delivered what she thought was the ultimate psychological blow. Jamal is going to get out of jail. He is going to call his real investors, the ones who are not vindictive family members, and we are going to bounce back stronger than ever. But you will be alone in this glass tower forever. You can keep your dirty money, Claire. Just give us back the mansion and the clean financial slate we deserve, and we will walk away and pretend you died. Richard had completely run out of patience for the emotional theatrics. He did not care about Audrey's fake tears or Patricia's psychological evaluations. He only cared about his bottom line, his plummeting credit score, and his impending bankruptcy. He stepped around his weeping daughter and marched directly to the head of the obsidian table towering over my seated position in a blatant attempt at physical intimidation. "Enough of this ridiculous nonsense," Richard bellowed, slamming his heavy hand on the table one more time. "We are not running a group therapy session. We are conducting a transaction. You have had your fun, Claire. You got to play the big, powerful boss. You humiliated us in front of the authorities and our entire social circle. You made your point. Now this childish game is over, Ms." He reached into his tailored breast pocket and pulled out a silver fountain pen, tossing it aggressively onto the polished surface so that it clattered right next to my espresso cup. "I am not going to stand here and argue with a disobedient child," Richard commanded, his voice rumbling with ultimate patriarchal authority. "I am still your father, and you will show me the respect I deserve. You will pull up the legal documents regarding my guarantor agreement right now. You will sign a full release of financial liability. You will instruct your highly paid lawyers to drop the eviction lawsuit against Jamal, and you will restore the lease on that Seattle property under my name. We are moving back into that house today." He leaned closer across the table, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of stale coffee and the cheap motel soap from last night. "Do not push me, Claire. You think you hold all the cards because your name is on a piece of paper. I gave you life. I put a roof over your head for 18 years. You owe me everything. You will wipe out this debt, and you will do it this exact second, or so help me. I will make sure the media knows exactly what kind of ruthless, ungrateful monster is running Apex Holdings. Pick up the pen and sign the papers, now." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his demand hung heavily in the room. They had broken into my corporate sanctuary. They had insulted my character, diagnosed me as a sociopath, and threatened to smear my name in the press. And after all of that, they expected me to simply hand over an $800,000 pardon just because they demanded it. The toxic pressure they generated was supposed to crush me. It was supposed to trigger the conditioned obedience of a terrified daughter. They pushed the conflict to its absolute peak, expecting me to finally break and surrender under the overwhelming weight of their combined wrath. I did not break. I did not surrender. I simply looked at the silver fountain pen resting on the obsidian table, then back up at my father's red, sweating face. The sheer volume of their screaming had left them breathless. They were panting, waiting for my inevitable collapse, waiting for the tears of a guilty daughter who had finally been put in her place. Instead, I leaned forward in my ergonomic leather chair, bridging the physical distance Richard had tried to dominate. I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I pressed a single discreet button on a concealed panel beneath the edge of my desk. A hidden compartment in the center of the massive conference table slid open with a soft, mechanical hum. From it, I extracted a thick, heavily bound dossier stamped with the Apex Holdings legal seal. I lifted it and let it drop onto the polished obsidian surface. It hit with a heavy, resounding thud that echoed like a gavel striking a sound block. The sharp noise made my mother physically flinch. The silence stretched for a long, suffocating moment. Then I spoke, my voice entirely devoid of anger, completely stripped of the emotional volatility they were so desperately trying to provoke. I did not set a trap. I stated clearly, letting each word land like a physical strike. I do not have the time, the energy, or the desire to orchestrate an elaborate conspiracy against people who are entirely irrelevant to my daily corporate operations. I reached out and flipped the heavy cover of the dossier open. I separated a thick stack of printed documents and pushed them forcefully across the smooth glass. They slid to a halt right in front of Patricia's trembling hands. Those are Jamal's corporate bank statements. I explained, my tone clinical and detached. The exact ones he submitted to my acquisitions team to secure his funding. And directly beneath them are the actual verified bank records we pulled during our routine forensic audit. Feel free to examine them, Patricia. He photoshopped extra zeros onto his balances. He forged routing numbers. He invented entire revenue streams from dummy corporations that do not exist anywhere on this planet. Patricia stared at the papers, her eyes darting over the highlighted discrepancies, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The undeniable proof of her golden son-in-law's criminality was printed in black and white right in front of her. I slid a second stack of papers toward Audrey, who was still gripping the armrests of her chair like a terrified passenger on a crashing flight. "These are the user acquisition logs for his supposed revolutionary software," I said. "Our engineering department traced the IP addresses last week. 98% of his daily active users are automated bots operating out of a cheap server farm in Eastern Europe. He did not build a tech empire, Audrey. He built a digital mirage to keep you draped in silk and diamonds you could not afford." Audrey looked down at the irrefutable data, her chest heaving as the reality of her fake marriage was spelled out in binary code and network logs. She shrank back into her seat, her earlier theatrical confidence completely destroyed. I finally turned my unwavering gaze back to Richard. The arrogant patriarch was staring at the forged bank statements with a look of dawning, terrifying comprehension. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking frail and old. "I did not force Jamal to commit federal wire fraud," I continued, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "I did not force him to stop paying rent for 6 months on a property he could not afford. I did not force him to lie to you to marry my sister under false pretenses or to trick you into signing away your retirement estate. He did all of that entirely on his own. I simply caught him." I leaned back, resting my elbows on the arms of my chair, steepling my fingers. "You marched into my building accusing me of jealousy and mental illness. You claim I am a sociopath who wants to see you suffer. But the reality is far simpler and clearly much harder for you to swallow." I paused, ensuring I had their absolute undivided attention. The air in the boardroom felt heavy, charged with the undeniable weight of the truth. I am a businesswoman. I run a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. My strict fiduciary duty is to protect my assets and my shareholders from financial predators. Jamal is a predator. He attempted to steal $5 million from my company. I responded exactly how I would respond to any other corporate thief. I followed the law, and I adhered strictly to fundamental business principles. I reached across the table and picked up Richard's silver fountain pen. I twisted it slowly between my fingers, examining the engraved metal before tossing it casually back at his chest. He fumbled clumsily to catch it, stumbling backward a step as if I had thrown a weapon at him. "There will be no release of financial liability," I told him, my voice dropping to a deadly, icy calm. "There will be no withdrawn eviction notice. You signed a legally binding commercial contract. You guaranteed the massive debt of a man you were too busy bragging about to actually investigate. Your signature is on the bottom line, Richard, not mine. You preached about personal responsibility my entire life. Now you get to experience it firsthand." The sharp, undeniable truth sliced through the boardroom, shredding their flimsy justifications and hypocritical moral high ground into confetti. The documents scattered across the table were undeniable proof of Jamal's crimes and their own blind, catastrophic arrogance. They could no longer hide behind the illusion of a malicious, jealous daughter trying to ruin their happiness. The hard data proved that I was simply a titan of industry executing a standard operational procedure against a desperate criminal. Their entire narrative collapsed in real time. The toxic, manipulative armor they had worn for my entire life was completely stripped away, leaving them exposed, financially ruined, and utterly defenseless against the cold, hard facts. They had no counter-argument. They had no leverage. They were standing in the heart of my empire, staring at the physical evidence of their own stupidity, finally realizing that the daughter they had discarded had evolved into an untouchable force of nature. The heavy silence in the boardroom was only broken by the sound of Richard's ragged breathing. He stared at the silver fountain pen lying uselessly on the dark glass table, his ultimate symbol of authority reduced to a meaningless piece of metal. The realization that I was not going to sign away his massive debt was finally crushing the last of his resistance. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, completely stripped of every ounce of pride he had worn like armor for 30 years. Patricia, realizing that anger and aggressive manipulation had failed spectacularly, immediately pivoted to her absolute last resort. She threw away her aristocratic posture, planted her hands on the table, and leaned forward with genuine desperate tears streaming down her face. She abandoned the poised country club matriarch persona, reverting to raw, unfiltered panic. "Claire, please," Patricia sobbed, her voice cracking as she abandoned her fake high society accent. "You cannot take our home. It is our retirement estate. We worked our entire lives for that house. If the bank forecloses, we have absolutely nothing. We will be sleeping in that cheap motel forever. You cannot punish us for Jamal's crimes. We were tricked by a professional con artist. We are victims too. You have billions of dollars. $800,000 is pocket change to you. You could wipe out this debt right now and your company would barely even notice it is gone." I looked at my mother, watching her perform this pathetic display of manufactured vulnerability. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no guilt, there was no sympathy, there was no maternal obligation pulling at my conscience. "It is not about the money, Patricia," I said, my voice cutting through her sobs like a scalpel. "It has never been about the money. It is entirely about the choices you made. You all chose to blindly trust a charismatic braggart and humiliated me. This is the direct, unavoidable consequence of your own stupidity and cruelty." Audrey let out a pathetic whimper, hugging herself tightly as she stared at the floor. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my parents, refusing to let them look away from the reality of their actions. "You stood on that porch and told me my very existence was an embarrassment to your wealthy image," I reminded them, ensuring they remembered every single cruel word they had spoken just hours ago. "You told me to go back to my struggling lifestyle. You deliberately chose to worship a fake billionaire and treat your own daughter like trash because he offered you a shortcut to the elite social status you crave. What is happening right now is not a tragedy, it is justice." Richard slammed his hand against the side of his chair, refusing to accept complete defeat. "We are your parents," he roared, his voice thick with desperate rage and sheer panic. "We gave you everything. We clothed you. We fed you. We raised you. You owe us a basic level of human decency. You cannot just stand by and watch us lose our home when you have the power to stop it with a single phone call." "I owe you," I repeated, leaning forward, matching his intensity with absolute frigid calm. "You kicked me out the exact second I turned 18 because I refused to major in the degree you demanded. You changed the locks on the front door. You told me I was dead weight. When I was scrubbing floors at night to pay for my own tuition, I begged you for a tiny $500 loan just to buy textbooks so I would not fail my classes. You laughed in my face and told me to learn the harsh realities of the real world. That very same week, you bought Audrey a brand new convertible for getting a C average." I stood up from my executive chair, establishing absolute physical dominance over the room. "I learned the harsh realities of the real world, Richard. I learned them so well that I conquered it. And now you are standing in my empire begging for the exact same mercy you gleefully denied me. You are right about one thing. I do have the power to stop your foreclosure with a single phone call. I could wire $800,000 to your bank account right now, and my financial portfolio would not even register a blip." I paused, letting that reality sink deep into their minds. I let them taste the proximity of salvation, letting the hope rise in their chests before I snatched it away forever. "But I am not going to do that," I stated with absolute finality. "I am not going to give you a single cent. I will not pay off Jamal's fraudulent lease. I will not release the lien on your retirement estate. I am officially cutting off every single avenue of financial rescue you thought you had." Audrey suddenly threw herself out of her chair, dropping to her knees on the floor of my boardroom. She actually clasped her hands together, looking up at me like a beggar pleading with royalty. "Claire, please," Audrey wailed, abandoning every ounce of the superiority she had weaponized against me for 3 decades. "My marriage is a lie. I have no job. I have massive credit card debt. If Mom and Dad lose their house, I have nowhere to go. I will be on the street. You have to help me. I am your sister." I looked down at her, feeling a profound, incredible sense of closure. "You stopped being my sister the moment you stood in that dining room, wrapped in a dress bought with stolen money, and laughed while our father threw me out into the freezing cold," I told her. "You wanted to play the high society elite. You wanted to mock the working class." "Well, welcome to the working class, Audrey. I suggest you start updating your resume. Retail stores are always hiring this time of year." The absolute finality of my words extinguished the very last spark of hope in the room. The fight completely drained out of Richard. He slumped back into his chair, looking like a deflated balloon, his eyes staring blankly at the wall as he calculated his impending bankruptcy. Patricia covered her face, rocking back and forth as she cried, mourning the permanent death of her country club lifestyle. Audrey remained on the floor, weeping violently into the carpet. I had officially severed the final cord. There would be no bailouts. There would be no secret family loans. I had permanently sealed the vault, leaving them to face the absolute devastation they had brought upon themselves. I watched them for another minute, allowing the stark reality of their new existence to settle heavily into the atmosphere of the boardroom. The air, which had been thick with their entitled demands just half an hour ago, was now suffocating with their absolute despair. Audrey remained crumpled on the floor, her expensive mascara staining the pristine corporate carpet. Patricia was shivering, wrapping her arms tightly around herself, as if trying to hold the shattered pieces of her country club persona together. Richard just stared blankly at the obsidian table, his mind paralyzed by the impending doom of his ruined credit and lost retirement. They were waiting for a miracle, hoping that my silence meant I was reconsidering. They thought the biological bond we shared would eventually override my business logic. They were wrong. I reached across my desk and pressed the silver intercom button. My executive assistant answered immediately, her voice crisp and professional through the speaker. "Send security up to the penthouse boardroom," I instructed smoothly. "We have 3 unauthorized visitors who need to be escorted off the premises immediately." The moment the words left my mouth, Patricia let out a strangled gasp. She scrambled to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "Claire, no," she pleaded, reaching her hands out across the table but not daring to touch me. "You cannot throw your own mother out of your office with security guards. People will see, the employees will talk." Even now, facing absolute financial annihilation, her primary concern was public perception. She was terrified of the humiliation of being paraded through a corporate lobby like a common trespasser. I simply looked at her, my expression completely blank. "I am protecting my company from hostile individuals," I replied calmly. "Your social anxiety is no longer a factor in my decision-making process." The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. 4 massive security guards in tailored black suits stepped into the room. They did not ask questions. They did not hesitate. They moved with absolute silent efficiency. 2 of them flanked Richard, who instinctively raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. The fight had completely drained from his body. He was no longer the roaring patriarch demanding obedience. He was just a terrified, bankrupt old man being ushered out of a building he had zero power over. The other 2 guards approached Patricia and Audrey. Audrey had to be physically lifted from the carpet. She wailed loudly, clinging to her mother's arm, her designer silk dress looking like a dirty, wrinkled rag. "Mom, you need to walk toward the elevator right now," the lead guard stated firmly, placing a stern hand on Patricia's shoulder. "Do not make us use force." They began a slow, humiliating march out of my private sanctuary. I stood up from my executive chair and followed them at a comfortable distance, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. I wanted to watch them leave. I wanted to witness the exact second they were permanently removed from my life. They shuffled down the wide, brightly lit hallway, passing by glass enclosed offices, where my highly paid executives and analysts paused their work to watch the spectacle. The same family who had obsessed over maintaining a flawless superior image was now being publicly humiliated in front of the most powerful financial minds in Seattle. Richard kept his head bowed, his shoulders hunched, completely destroyed by the silent judgment of the corporate elite. Patricia tried to hide her face behind her cheap purse, sobbing quietly as the security detail marched them relentlessly forward. The guards herded them into the private express elevator. The polished steel doors remained open for just a few seconds, while the guards stepped back, forming a solid physical barrier between my family and me. Patricia turned around one last time. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She looked at me standing there in my tailored suit, completely untouchable, surrounded by the empire I had built from the ashes of their rejection. "Claire," Patricia whispered, her voice cracking pitifully. "Please, you are our daughter." I stepped forward, stopping just inches from the security guards. I looked directly into Patricia's eyes, then shifted my gaze to Richard, and finally to Audrey. I made sure they saw absolutely no hesitation, no guilt, and no regret in my expression. I gave them a cold, brilliant smile. "Next time you want to kick someone out of a house," I said, my voice ringing clear and sharp in the quiet hallway, "make sure you actually own it." The color drained entirely from their faces as my words struck them like physical blows. The perfect poetic justice of the statement paralyzed them completely. Before any of them could formulate a single word in response, the heavy steel doors of the elevator slid shut, sealing them inside and cutting them off from my world forever. The electronic chime signaled their descent, carrying them down to the street level and out of my life permanently. I stood in the quiet hallway for a long moment, listening to the soft hum of the building. The air felt incredibly light. The invisible, suffocating chains of familial obligation, guilt, and the desperate need for their approval had completely vanished. I had spent 32 years trying to mold myself into a shape that would satisfy their toxic, impossible standards. I had endured their mocking laughter, their public humiliations, and their cruel dismissals. Now, in the span of less than 24 hours, the entire power dynamic had been permanently inverted. I turned my back to the elevator and walked toward my boardroom. I did not feel empty. I did not feel the lingering sadness that therapists often claim follows a family estrangement. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute liberation. The corporate machine around me continued its relentless, efficient pace. My executive assistant handed me a tablet with the morning acquisition reports, acting as if the dramatic expulsion of my biological family had simply been another routine business transaction. And in many ways it was. I had identified a toxic liability, neutralized the threat, and liquidated the bad asset. I walked back into my private office, the panoramic view of the Seattle skyline stretching out endlessly before me. The city was full of opportunities, massive investments, and a future I controlled completely. I sat down at my desk, opened my encrypted laptop, and went back to work. The chapter of my life involving Richard, Patricia, and Audrey was permanently closed. I was finally free and my empire was just getting started. 6 months passed. The bitter, freezing Seattle winter gave way to a bright and unforgiving spring. I sat at the same obsidian conference table in my penthouse office, my fingers casually tracing the rim of a fresh espresso cup. Resting on the glass surface in front of me was the morning edition of the Pacific Northwest Business Journal. I did not buy it for the market analysis. I bought it for the headline splashed across the bottom half of the front page. The article detailed the official sentencing of Jamal Harrison. The federal judge had shown absolutely zero leniency for his massive financial crimes. The charismatic tech visionary who had once commanded my family's dining room table with a crystal flute of champagne was now formally a convicted felon. The investigation had uncovered a staggering web of wire fraud, forged bank statements, and predatory borrowing. Jamal was handed a severe federal prison sentence. He traded his custom-tailored velvet blazers for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The article noted that he stood in the courtroom completely alone during his sentencing. No high society friends came to his defense. No wealthy investors wrote character references. His digital mirage had completely evaporated, leaving him to face the cold concrete reality of a federal penitentiary cell. His inevitable downfall had dragged the rest of my family directly into the abyss alongside him. Audrey had scrambled to file for divorce the very second the police hauled Jamal away from Mr. Mitchell's law office. She desperately tried to play the victim, claiming she was entirely ignorant of his crimes. But ignorance did not wipe out the massive, suffocating mountain of debt they had accumulated together. Audrey had eagerly co-signed several high-interest luxury credit cards to fund her lavish influencer lifestyle. She had financed the designer silk dresses, the extravagant vacations, and the massive diamond engagement ring that the bank swiftly repossessed. With no college degree, no actual work experience, and a reputation permanently tied to a convicted fraudster, Audrey's life imploded. Her hundreds of thousands of social media followers abandoned her account overnight. The elite brands she used to tag in her posts blocked her completely. Left with zero options and debt collectors harassing her phone every single hour, the golden child was forced to enter the real world. Audrey currently works 40 hours a week as a cashier at a discount supermarket on the outskirts of the city. The sister who once sneered at my corporate job now spends her days standing under harsh fluorescent lights, wearing a scratchy polyester uniform and a plastic name tag. Her perfectly manicured nails are chipped and broken from scanning endless barcodes and bagging canned goods. The ultimate humiliation came when her former wealthy friends spotted her working the register. They did not say hello. They just whispered to each other, paid for their groceries, and looked at her with the exact same disgust she used to reserve for me. Richard and Patricia suffered a fate that was to them far worse than prison. They suffered absolute social death. The bankruptcy courts were methodical and ruthless. The bank seized their sprawling retirement estate, liquidating it to cover the massive guarantor debt Richard had so arrogantly signed. The luxury vehicles were repossessed from their driveway in broad daylight while the neighbors watched. Patricia was forced to sell off her beloved pearl necklaces, her designer handbags, and the antique silverware just to pay for their bankruptcy lawyers. My parents were violently ejected from the elite social circles they worshipped. Their country club membership was immediately revoked. The high society friends they had spent decades trying to impress stopped returning their phone calls entirely. When Patricia bumped into the mayor's wife at a discount pharmacy 2 months ago, the woman looked right through my mother as if she were completely invisible. It broke Patricia's spirit entirely. My parents now live in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a decaying building that constantly smells like boiled cabbage and cheap cleaning supplies. Richard, the man who used to boast about building a financial legacy, now spends his days calculating how to stretch his meager Social Security checks to cover their basic utilities. They have absolutely nothing left to brag about, nobody left to impress, and no golden daughter to fund their delusions. They are rotting away in the exact poverty they spent their entire lives mocking. As for Rachel, the traitor who traded a decade of my friendship for a fleeting taste of fake luxury, her erasure was absolute. The intellectual property theft report I filed with the National Ethics Board destroyed her career overnight. She was blacklisted from every media and public relations agency in the country. She tried to pivot to freelance consulting, but the shadow of Apex Global Media was far too vast. No corporate entity would touch a proven plagiarist. Her luxury downtown apartment was quickly seized when she defaulted on the rent. Stripped of her stolen title and her 6-figure salary, Rachel was forced to pack her belongings into a rented van and move back into her childhood bedroom in a rural, forgotten town. She vanished entirely from the corporate elite, becoming a cautionary tale of what happens when you sell your soul for a seat at a crumbling table. I finished reading the article about Jamal and folded the newspaper with a crisp, satisfying crease. I dropped it casually into the recycling bin beneath my desk. The universe had balanced its scales with terrifying precision. Every single person who had conspired to humiliate me, abuse me, and steal from me had walked directly into their own perfect destruction. They had been crushed by the sheer weight of their own greed and arrogance. I did not have to lift a finger to ruin their lives. I simply removed the safety net they never appreciated and let gravity do the rest. I turned my chair to face the massive window, looking out over the vibrant, bustling city. The morning sun was reflecting brilliantly off the water of the Puget Sound. My schedule for the day was packed with aggressive acquisitions, philanthropic board meetings, and massive global investments. My empire was thriving, expanding faster and more powerfully than ever before. I picked up my phone to review the guest list for my upcoming Thanksgiving dinner. This year, the table would be set in the very mansion my family had been evicted from. But the chairs would be filled with brilliant entrepreneurs, loyal colleagues, and genuine friends who had stood by me when I had absolutely nothing. There would be no toxic comparisons, no desperate social climbing, and no ungrateful relatives. There would only be the warmth of chosen family and the sweet, undeniable taste of absolute victory. Exactly 1 year after that frozen, chaotic night, the very same mansion glowed with an entirely different kind of light. The oppressive, pretentious atmosphere Audrey had cultivated was completely eradicated. I had stripped away the gaudy faux Italian marble and the flashy, tasteless chandeliers that reeked of desperate social climbing. In their place, the grand dining room now featured warm, natural oak, tasteful modern art from emerging creators I personally sponsored, and a massive rustic dining table built for actual human connection rather than arrogant display. The air did not smell of cheap, heavy perfume and mounting anxiety. It smelled of roasted garlic, fresh herbs, and my signature truffle-stuffed turkey baking to perfection in the chef's kitchen. This Thanksgiving, the driveway was not blocked by leased luxury sports cars or an arrogant father demanding my departure. It was filled with the modest, reliable vehicles of people I deeply respected. I walked through the vibrant, warmly lit living room, a genuine smile gracing my face as I watched my guests interact. Benjamin, my brilliant chief financial officer, who had flawlessly executed the financial kill switch that doomed Jamal's fraudulent empire, was standing by the roaring stone fireplace. He was laughing warmly, trading stories with Naomi, a friend I had known since my earliest days, scrubbing floors at the private equity firm. Naomi had shared her meager lunches with me when I could barely afford to eat. Now she was the lead director of my philanthropic foundation, managing millions of dollars in educational grants. Next to them stood Ms. Kensington, the razor-sharp legal representative who had dropped the eviction notice on my parents' plates. Tonight she wore a comfortable cashmere sweater instead of her intimidating gray suit, holding a plate of appetizers and smiling brightly. This was what true, unshakable wealth looked like. It was not about impressing strangers with fake designer dresses or maintaining a fragile illusion of superiority. It was the ability to fill a massive room with people who knew your heart, who respected your grueling journey, and who never had to lie about who they were. We did not need to perform for one another. We simply existed comfortable and safe in the empire we had built together through mutual trust and unwavering loyalty. I moved effortlessly through the gathering, refilling wine glasses and sharing easy, unforced conversations. There were no snide comments about my appearance. There were no backhanded compliments designed to make me feel small. When someone praised my business acumen, it was grounded in actual data and shared victories, not the desperate, hollow bragging that used to echo off these very walls. I felt a profound, grounding sense of belonging. The crippling imposter syndrome that Patricia and Richard had meticulously planted in my brain decades ago had been completely uprooted and destroyed. As the evening progressed and the guests began moving toward the dining table to take their seats for the feast, I excused myself for a brief moment. I picked up a crystal flute of vintage champagne and stepped out through the heavy French doors onto the back terrace. The crisp November air brushed against my face, a gentle, refreshing reminder of the bitter, biting chill from exactly a year ago. I leaned against the stone railing and looked out over the sprawling, perfectly manicured garden and the long, sweeping driveway, illuminated by soft landscape lighting. My mind briefly flashed back to the pathetic image of Richard, Patricia, and Audrey shivering on the curb, dragging their broken suitcases into the dark, freezing street. I waited for a familiar pang of guilt to surface, but the emotional well was completely dry. I felt no lingering anger. I felt no guilt whatsoever. The space in my heart that used to bleed endlessly for their approval was completely healed over with a thick, impenetrable layer of absolute peace. They were a closed chapter, a harsh, necessary lesson in setting boundaries that I had survived, conquered, and moved past. Society constantly conditions us to believe that blood ties are sacred, painting them as an unbreakable contract that demands endless forgiveness and perpetual sacrifice. We are falsely taught to endure toxic behavior, psychological manipulation, and outright emotional abuse simply because the perpetrators happen to share our DNA. We are told to keep the peace at the expense of our own sanity. But standing there on my terrace, listening to the joyous, authentic laughter of my chosen family ringing out from the dining room behind me, I knew the absolute, undeniable truth. Blood is nothing more than a biological coincidence. True family is an active, daily, intentional choice. Family is the people who stand fiercely by your side when you have absolutely nothing to offer them. Family is the people who celebrate your genuine success without a single drop of malicious jealousy. Family respects your boundaries, honors your struggles, and protects your peace at all costs. The people inside my house were my true family, and I had earned every single one of them. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, crisp autumn air. The stars were beginning to emerge in the clear night sky, reflecting perfectly on the still glass-like surface of the infinity pool. I turned my back to the darkness and faced the warm, inviting light radiating from my home. My people were waiting for me to carve the turkey. Benjamin caught my eye through the glass doors and raised his wine glass with a respectful, knowing nod. I raised my flute of champagne in return, holding it high against the backdrop of the illuminated Seattle skyline. I toasted to my resilience, to the brutal but necessary lessons learned, and to the magnificent, unshakable freedom I had finally claimed. The heavy velvet curtain had permanently fallen on their pathetic, toxic tragedy, and my beautiful, peaceful reality was continuing exactly as I designed it. The story of Claire's ultimate triumph over her toxic, image-obsessed relatives offers a profound and necessary realization. Blood ties are not an unbreakable contract to endure abuse. For decades, society has relentlessly pushed the narrative that we must automatically forgive and accommodate our family members, regardless of how deeply or frequently they wound us. Claire's journey brilliantly dismantles this toxic expectation. Her parents and sister prioritized a glossy, superficial facade and a charismatic fraud over the genuine loyalty of their own flesh and blood. They falsely believed that deploying guilt, psychological manipulation, and the sheer weight of parental authority would permanently force Claire into submission. However, Claire's quiet, calculated response teaches us that the most powerful defense against narcissistic abuse is absolute emotional detachment. She did not seek revenge through explosive screaming matches. She simply stood her ground and removed the financial and emotional safety nets her abusers had always taken for granted. The most liberating takeaway from this drama is that family is an active daily choice, not just a biological coincidence. We have the absolute right to rigorously curate our inner circle. When Claire replaced her toxic biological relatives with loyal colleagues and genuine friends at her Thanksgiving table, she proved that true wealth is not about luxury estates or venture capital. True wealth is surrounding yourself with individuals who celebrate your authentic successes without malicious jealousy and who fiercely respect the boundaries you set to protect your peace. We are completely allowed to walk away from toxicity even when it shares our DNA. Reclaiming your life requires the incredible courage to permanently lock the door on those who constantly tear you down. If you are currently holding on to a destructive relationship purely out of familial obligation, take a bold step back today and choose to protect your own peace.